We are very, very, I think, privileged to have Sri Jawhar Sircar here to deliver the very first of the series which we hope to establish from today, which is the Sadhan C. Dutt Memorial Lecture. This eponymous lecture was instituted in honor of the values and principles upheld by the late founder chairman of Development Consultants, a pioneer in the field of engineering whose significant work in building the technological capacity of the nation and establishing the high standards of Indian engineering expertise internationally are widely recognized. His contribution to the fields of education, healthcare, urban welfare, rural upliftment, and his commitment to civic responsibility, national integration, and human values were fundamental to his belief system. As an entrepreneur who believed deeply in working towards the greater good of society, he was exemplary in combining a business success with a deep sense of responsibility to fellow human beings. The annual Sadhan C. Dutt Memorial Lecture aims to feature eminent activists, thinkers, and writers who are concerned with building a better and more equitable society for all. The very first edition of this lecture we inaugurate today, and I would like to invite Sri Jawhar Sircar to deliver his talk on Rammohan Roy, India's first public intellectual. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My respects to my seniors and best wishes to everyone else. It is my honor to be standing here to deliver the first Sadhan C. Dutt Memorial talk. I think I'm one of the few persons in this hall who had the honor to know Mr. Sadhan Dutt. In fact, when we were young officers, there was a time I was looking after the small-scale sector, the SME sector, and handicrafts. And that's a time when we should keep talking about Mr. Dutt, he was one of the first Indian entrepreneurs in America to relocate home, to come back to India. At that time, if I remember correctly, the company's name was Kuljian, which was Kuljian Corporation, changed to DCPL. It's my honor, because I knew him a bit. The topic that has been given to me is to view Rammohan Roy, whom we all know so well, from a different angle. From the angle of being India's first public intellectual. When I mean India, of course, I mean modern India. I'll explain why we consider him as the modern India's first public intellectual, among other things, because that particular term summarizes all his activities. We'll be discussing this thing about public intellectual tomorrow as well, in the context of Tagore. Tagore, as you know, comes much later. At the outset, I thank Shanta Ghosh, Anjum, Katyal, Mr. Chatterjee, and all others who have conceived this wonderful initiative for a Nabanna Earth Weekend at Shantiniketan in the middle of spring. It's an honor for me to begin this cultural event by delivering this talk. We keep hearing this term public intellectual more so in the last couple of decades. But many of us may still need to know what precisely the term public intellectual means. Where do we segregate between the intellectual as such and a public intellectual? In very short, a public intellectual is one who does not cultivate knowledge for the sake of knowledge. An intellectual does. But he relates his knowledge to society, takes up causes, steers them through opposition. That's an essential element. For a public individual needs to come out of his comfort zone of knowledge to take up an issue on which he or she feels very strongly, take the issue in spite of its relative or bitter unpopularity at that point of time, take up reform, use the strategy, the interrogative talent that he has used for his intellect, and battle it out for a better society. A public intellectual is therefore not one who stays in a comfort zone and acquires more and more knowledge. India's eminent historian Ramila Thapar has made my task easier by discussing the same question in a recent book entitled The Public Intellectuals in India. Ramila Thapar delivered a speech with which this book starts. To question or not to question, that is the question. That is the question. But the question, in it she expresses her anguish at the fact that we do not question enough. Even though India has a long tradition of public debate, and she cites the Buddha as one of the first embodiments of a public intellectual. For our purposes, as I said, the public intellectual is not one who knows a lot, but one who uses the acquired interrogative skills to relate to society and analyze the issues. He or she refuses to be in a comfort zone and raises pertinent questions, however uncomfortable they may appear. What defines a public intellectual is their ability to communicate intellectual pursuits to a broader public and to question the normative structure, irrespective of whether society at that point of time is prepared to accept these views or not. For instance, as a public intellectual, Rammohan's entire life was one of unpopularity. Retrospectively, we think of him as an extremely popular person, but in his personal life, he has to go through literally hell. He was a personal unpopularity and struggle, for he questioned those premises that were beyond question, and he did it all the time. Right from the Upanishadic period, that's around the early part of the first millennium, India has an age-old culture of questioning existing beliefs, texts, systems, and public authorities, both in the religious and the secular political domains. We have briefly touched upon Gautam Buddha, but the hard fact is that this practice had fallen into utter disuse by the late medieval and early modern periods. This is the time when the Mughal Empire is on its way out, anarchy has set in. This is the time when brute force reigns, and this is the time when colonial powers take best advantages of the situation. This practice had fallen into utter disuse by the late medieval and early modern period. This is when Rammohan arrived. There is no doubt that he surpassed all his contemporaries in India, and in fact emerged as the first Indian that the British ruling class took serious note of. In the 6 decades that followed Plassey, for 60 years after Plassey, not a single Indian could ever raise his voice. He either collaborated or got away from the scene, or was made to get away from the scene. But then we must realize that he was a private citizen, a native subject of British colonial power in India, with absolutely no special status or wealth. It goes therefore to his sole credit that he could nevertheless create a position for himself and succeed in influencing British policy British policy in favor of social reforms. Roy was the first Indian public intellectual to excel in placing critical issues in the public domain, especially before the English authorities, in their own language, with courage, conviction, and confidence. At no point am I saying that ever since India came under British rule, so to say, paramountcy from 1857, I'm not saying that no other Indian ever spoke on. They spoke. Many of them acquired English, but none of them spoke about anything other than themselves. As we shall see, he held their attention as he presented well-researched content on several issues with his proven command over the English language. Equally striking was the fact that the British took cognizance of him. That's an important part. They took cognizance of him even when they disagreed, which implicitly conferred on him a certain degree of relative equality. When you have to enter into a debate with a subject, you have denoted a certain degree of relative equality of status, which colonists were usually loath to accord to darker people. In order to appreciate the high regard with which he was viewed by the British, even in London, we may come across a notice in the Missionary Register of London. It appeared early in 1816, that's just about 2 years after he started his mission, when Rammohan had just about begun his mission. And this London newspaper calls him a Brahmin of great consideration and influence, shrewd, vigilant, active, ambitious, prepossessing in his manners, versed in several languages. It then goes on to relish his battles against Hindu idolatry and superstition. We are yet to come across a record of any Indian thinker and public activist before this who had reached such high consideration in Britain some 15 years before he made his first and last voyage to that country, the country that controlled India. In case one is under the impression that it was only Britain that had taken note of him, we turn to America, summer of 1818. The American Review extolled him. It declared that a learned and philosophic Rammohan Roy, distant Kolkata, was a virtuous individual who had advocated the cause of truth amidst obstacles. This is interesting. Amidst obstacles from which any ordinary mind would have shrunk. That is American appreciation of his task. The next such Indian to earn such handsome praise came full 75 years later. We refer to Swami Vivekananda. Rammohan was so ahead of everyone else. But it was not this extraordinary gift of communication that we remember Roy. We admire his unwavering faith in rationalism that he expressed through his writings and campaigns. Rammohan had complete mastery over Sanskrit and Bengali and skilled enough to converse well in Persian, Arabic and English. More important is that this dexterity as a polyglot and as a polymath conferred on him a rare skill, a rare genius to navigate between different cultures and ideas. He was the first multiculturalist. He could navigate between different worlds. He was then thus the first Indian in the 19th century who embodied India's age-old tradition of plurality and was uncompromising in his war against superstition and obscurantism. We will not elaborate on this point, as we are all aware of his struggle to abolish sati, the heinous practice of burning widows alive on the funeral pyres of their husbands. But we will emphasize on those actions where it comes out, which amplify his role as a public intellectual. We shall touch upon his role in spreading English education and in his passionate plea for women's rights, education and empowerment. We are talking of 1818 when we talk of women's empowerment. He is surely the father figure of the Indian Renaissance and best known rationalist of early modern India, who suffered for his beliefs from not only from the Orthodox Hindu, but Christians as well. It is interesting to note that even as they contested his interpretations and arguments, they could hardly ever deny his grasp over both religion and scriptures. What we need to take a note of this is that Rammohan thus created, through this debate, the first discursive public space in India. The discursive public space that we take for granted was first created in the 60th year of the Battle of Plassey by an individual who was not born with any privilege. Incidentally, as you know, the term Raja is given to him just before his death. He never enjoyed it in India. It's us, we, who keep referring. So I have never used the term Raja. A person born without privilege, without status, without wealth, creates for himself a position whereby he is in a position to carve out the first public discursive space in India. He was a pioneer of journalism and fought for equal treatment of Indians by the colonial regime. In his deposition before the House of Commons in 1832 and 33, where again he is the first Indian, the most unique position, he was fearless enough to complain against the misdeeds of the East India Company. No one would have the courage at that point of time to go to London to make his presentation before the British Parliament and complain about the East India Company. And volumes of it, not just complaints, passing complaints, volumes of written documents. As a public intellectual, he raised the issue of the exploitation of the peasantry by the company's installed zamindars. He himself had a few zamindaris, but that did not preclude him from taking up the issue of the exploitation of peasants. And one of his classic statements was, now that you have made a permanent settlement with zamindars, it is time for you to make a permanent settlement with peasants. Not only did Rammohan Roy strive for English education, as did Hindu Orthodox, but he was the severest critic of the East India Company's avowed policy on education. On the 11th of December 1823, Rammohan Roy wrote to the Governor General Amherst against the priority given to Sanskrit over English. Incidentally, he was himself a very well-known Sanskritist, but he protested. His words used was, Sanskrit can only be expected to load the minds of the youth with grammatical niceties and metaphysical distinctions of little or no practical use to society. The Sanskrit system of education will be best calculated to keep this country in darkness. It's very controversial, very strong views, but he was very clear about what he was saying. He wanted to bring in light through education in the English language for the sake of its brilliance and to reach out to the treasury of knowledge of the Western Enlightenment. Not like Macaulay, who wanted the same English education for the mass production of clerks and British loyalists. Then there's a portion I'll leave behind, not everything that I'll read. How, when Presidency College was being formed, obviously the natural leader in this initiative was Rammohan, because he had been fighting for this premier college, but when the turn came, he was told to drop out. Because by that time, the Hindu wealthy class had just had enough of it. It said either Rammohan or us. He was given a choice and he gracefully dropped out. The person who actually kept a record of it all was the chairman of the last meeting to set up the Hindu college. This was held on the 4th of May 1816, who records that Rammohan was gracious enough to concede and get done. Incidentally, at this Hindu college for which he strove so much, the first batch of English-educated young men who came out started the first radical movement under De Rosio, condemned Rammohan as not being radical enough. That's all right. He continued in his mission to spread Western education, and in 1822 he gave a big grant to start the High English School of the Unitarian Association that both David Hare and Reverend Adam were in the management. Then again, in 1830, he set up the General Assembly institution that would become the Scottish Church College. Roy utilized his weekly paper, Sangbar Komodi, to air his views on education and made repeated pleas to the government to expand English education free of cost. Then there's something interesting when one goes through these records, is that he began a series of articles on popular science in this paper, and referring to 1831, that referred to topics like the echo, magnets, magnetic properties, balloons, behavior of fishes. We see yet another first from Rammohan Roy, for he was definitely the first Indian to popularize science education in modern India. A less known fact is that when Rammohan became the first Indian to write directly in English to the Governor General of India, Lord Minto, in 1809, he actually introduced a new literary genre. This genre was Indian writing in English. He started that as well. He was not the first Indian writer in the English language, for one, Saqi-ud-Din Muhammad had published his travel accounts in 1793, making him the first Indian writer in the English language. But Saqi-ud-Din Muhammad disappears from the scene, whereas Rammohan continues unabated to work upon writing. Barnard Cohn, the American anthropologist, has a very interesting comment about Rammohan, about his letter to the Governor General in 1809. In writing to the Governor General in the language, style and manner he did, Rammohan was announcing to the British ruling class in India that he possessed command over the very language that was the language of command. He possessed command over the language at that time that was their language of command. Rammohan wrote more significant pieces from 1816, and then there's a list of English tracts that he's written. In fact, he went on to write 9 English monographs in 1 year, in 1823. Rammohan's preference for English often overshadows another aspect, his contribution to the development of the vernacular in modern India. He is among the earliest pioneers of Bengali prose, and he was among the first 3 to choose prose over the old age tradition of verse. He broke free from verse to write. When Rammohan settled in Kolkata in 1814, because he needed to be at the center of power, needed that position to convince his rulers, he considered it essential to reach out to his countrymen, and that is the time when he began using Bengali as an effective instrument to seek popular support for his socio-economic, social-religious reforms. He had his command over English, Sanskrit, Persian and Arabic had been established, but he needed the Bengali language more than all others now in order to get to his people, get them to his side. He communicated in Bengali to counter the vicious campaign that had been launched against his progressive ideas. But like Ram Basu and Mrityunjay Vidyalankar, he found these are the first 3 who started using prose. Rammohan found that the Bengali language of the time did not have sufficient numbers of the right words or expressions to convey the desired meanings. And these 3 are credited with what we call short bhava, distinctly the right words, where such polemical, the language was perfect where conversation was concerned, but the moment you get into polemical battles, you get into intricacies, didn't have words. So all 3 therefore innovated and enriched the language with Sanskrit words. He was positively the first Bengali in modern India to democratize knowledge through the vernacular. The esoteric Hindu scriptures were beyond the grasp of most of his countrymen, as all of them were in Sanskrit. Besides, they were the exclusive property of a very narrow class of Brahmanical scholars. His transliteration of the Vedanta text in 1815 served the twin purposes of reaching these teachings and their purport and his interpretation, that's more important, and his interpretation to the people in their language. Rammohan never stopped from using language as a very effective weapon. He chose his weapons to serve his purpose, gave his interpretation, and when he gave his first interpretation of the Rig Veda or Vedanta, Bengalis were hardly, these texts were hardly known. It sounds very peculiar, but these texts were hardly known to the Bengalis in the early part of the 19th century. Amyo Sen has calculated that Rammohan and his co-workers produced 23 texts and pamphlets in Bengali, where he sets the agenda of the language, that were exclusively on religious subjects, and 15 more literary pieces. Rammohan's cross-cultural skills enabled him to traverse different worlds, reflected through different languages with ease and at will. We move on to another remarkable cross-cultural skill of Rammohan, his command over Arabic and Persian. Now here, when we start analyzing, it's time to get a little more practical. In the hagiography that surrounds much of what Rammohan did, we are taught that he was sent to Patna to learn Persian and Arabic, and he learned the Quran by the time he was 10. He read Euclid through Arabic. These stories are fed to us when we are children. And the next story that appears in all the history books, that tragedy is, when I went through about a dozen plus books to write this, all the 12 books mentioned his education at 9 at Patna, where he picked up Arabic and Persian, and at 14 to Benares, where he picked up Sanskrit and the Hindu text. None of these can be proved with facts. Rajendranath Bandyopadhyay, who made it his lifetime's mission to go through records, came out and proved that none of these are true. So the idea is that while we extol the virtues of a man, we need to be scientific, need to be clear, and the geography just doesn't work. He learned his Sanskrit from Nandakumar Vidyalankar, and he learned his Persian from his father and his grandfather, both of whom knew Persian, but he practiced his skills on his own. As for Arabic, there were enough seminaries in Bengal, 600 years of Muslim rule, to pick up Arabic. He was attached for about 3 years to the Sadar Diwani Adalat, and that is where he practiced his skills. What is remarkable that the first book he published on religion was entitled Tuhfat-ul-Muhammadin, a gift to monotheists, somewhere between 1803 and 4. He didn't sign the date. Max Muller considered this his primary and overriding statement on religion. In Islam, he was attracted not to Sufi mysticism, that most people are attracted, but to its strict monotheism and to its rational approach. Rogenseil again analyzes Roy's marked preferences for the rationalist, even in Islam. As the first modern Indian, he set down, so to say, the agenda for others to follow, which is a deep, abiding respect for the best that Islam, Christianity, and Hinduism had to offer. His rationality did not lead to atheism, as it usually does, but to a strong secular plural approach. Rammohan's campaign for women's rights comes out best in his second tract that he wrote in 1819 against Sati. He wrote 2 tracts against this terrible practice of burning widows alive. One was in 1819, the other was in 1818, the other was in 1819. The second tract is actually a response to the views of Brahmin Sanskrit scholar Kashinath Tarkavigesh, who glorified Sati. But if one leaves that argument away, this writing is also considered the first known essay in the history of modern India on gender, where he negated the argument that women were essentially ignorant and unintelligent. These were inscribed views of Hindu society and many conservative societies. He threw the counter question as to why no attempt was ever made to educate them to attain their real worth. He went on this, and Rammohan was the first advocate of women's rights in modern India. And I'm talking of 1890, far ahead of others. His battle against Sati was only a part of his campaign against the suppression of women. He was actually the first one to point out an issue that no historian has really pursued very seriously. He said that Sati brought in economic gains to the male members of the survivor's family. It is for the same reason that women in Bengal who could not be consigned to flames were sent away to Mathura and Vrindavan and Kashi to get them out of the way. This part has never been pursued well enough. In 1822, Rammohan wrote strongly against Hindu laws that had steadily gone on depriving women throughout history. In his monograph that was entitled Modern Encroachments on the Ancient Rights of Females According to Hindu Laws of Inheritance, Roy took up cudgels against the core of Bengali laws, the Jawhar system. He didn't accuse the system, he accused the interpretations that Brahmanical scholasticism had put on Jawhar. Among his other contributions were, as the first public intellectual of modern India, was his role as a journalist. Rammohan Roy was quick to realize the power of the press, and in 1821 he began publishing his Bengali newspaper called Sangvad Kaumudi. It didn't last too long, but in a brilliant flash, we have a lot of interesting records coming out of him. In 1822, we began a newspaper called Miratul Akhbar, that is Mirror of the News. Within a year, however, he stopped its publication in protest against the Press Regulation Act that imposed licensing and several restrictions on free speech. We may recall that Rammohan is best remembered by the Indian language press for his strong petition to the British government against this Press Act. It's in fact the first document in favor of free press in India. He was so dogged that he went all the way up to the British Crown, where he lost the case in the Supreme Court. He went all the way to the British Crown. Roy also brought out, as a true public intellectual, Rammohan embarked on a crusade against the discriminatory provisions of the Jury Act of 1826 that introduced divisions between Indians and Europeans and between believers of different religions. That is what made him a brilliant public intellectual whose words the British ruling class and the informed public sat up to take notice in India and as well as in England. To recapitulate, he was surely the first modern Indian and an uncompromising rationalist who possessed extraordinary skills as a public intellectual and as a crusader for justice. His battle against Sati and other evils, his sincerity in spreading Western education, the Enlightenment and rationality, his espousal of the cause of woman are all the stuff of legends. His great achievement was to create the first discursive public space in India, which he could thanks to his command over 5 languages. He was the first major Indian communicator in the English language who assumed a level of equality with his colonial rulers. He crossed different cultures and civilizations with the ease of a born internationalist. He popularized the scientific temper, and as modern India's first public intellectual, Raja Rammohan Roy was certainly miles ahead of other Indians of this time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jawhar. That was certainly a really eye-opening journey through the kind of contribution Rammohan Roy has made to a society which we have inherited and been lucky enough to inherit. And your particular emphasis on the role of the public intellectual as somebody who dares to ask questions and to question and challenge and risk unpopularity and anti-establishment, anti-normative beliefs, I think is a very, very important message and reminder to us today, because we seem to be slipping into a land which is not allowing questioning and challenging and dissension. So I think that is a very, very timely reminder that we have a rich history that goes back, of course, even beyond Raja Rammohan Roy, as you mentioned, of being a country that allows this kind of debate and challenging and questioning and rational thought. So thank you very much. We have a few minutes. Would anybody like to ask any questions? Can we give him a mic?
Sure. If we should go to read Raja Rammohan Roy today, what should we read? Is there a book, an anthology of his work that gives a representative portrait of the man?
You want a ready book on Rammohan?
Yes.
I think Amir P. Sen, his critical biography, that's 2015, is pretty new. He covers a lot of ground, but then again, the problem with reading, he is a professor, and sort of that brings in certain constrictions. He is one of the most lucid writers, and one of the persons who doesn't believe in bullshitting around. He calls a spade a spade. He pulls up Rammohan at various times, but most important, he pulls up those biographers of Rammohan who sort of built him up. But then there are some parts that would need to be understood. So maybe when you get stuck at a place, you'll have to ask Professor Google or ask me. There are some parts where you need to know a bit of what actually happened. It's not a very complicated life. I mean, please.
Yes, I was very impressed with your lecture, learned a lot, especially the public intellectual. I don't think I understood that very well. You explained it very nicely. Thank you. I have just one question. Was he involved with Brahmo religion?
Yes, it's so obvious. He is the founder of Brahmo religion. I can pick on the obvious ones. His battle on Sati is so well known, everyone knows. He set up the Brahmo Sabha. Actually, he never set up the Brahmo Sabha, he set up the Brahmo Samaj. But anyway, so Athiya Sabha pore jeta, Brahmo Samaj. Athiya Sabha, Brahmo Samaj was set up in 1830, just before he left. And when he was in England, the name was turned from Brahmo Samaj to Brahmo Sabha. So anyway, so these are very well known. I picked them because it's a very eventful life. I picked up on those issues that people are not fully aware, like the first person who raised the gender issue. The next person who would raise it would come 40 years later. The first person to raise science education, the next person to raise science education would come 70 years later. The first person to make an impression on the American public, the next chap would come in 75 years later. So he was way ahead of his time. And the best thing that one needs to remember, and nobody talks about it, as the first major social and religious reformer, he could have been Guru Rammohan. He could have started a Guruvada. Just like we have Dayanand Saraswati. Now, Dayanand Saraswati, who followed him about 40 years later, 35 years later, is treated almost as God. In various parts of North India, you can go and see temples to Dayanand and things like that. He resisted the temptation of being treated as God. He did not exploit the fact that he had complete command over a section of the people, and he did not use it for his own personal benefit. He could have become Guru Rammohan, what it means, Guru. He was far ahead of them. But the fact that he sort of abjured this, he stayed away from this temptation, and he never allowed the personality cult to develop. Well, then how do you get these hagiographic descriptions? How do you reconcile? There are issues.
There's one question in the front row. No, that's been answered. Yes, that will have to be our last question. Please go ahead.
I think, am I loud enough?
Yes.
It's not a question, it's just an observation, Jawhar, because all your perspectives are so fresh and original. I mean, I really marvel at the research work that you do
Please
and you
tell
come
my
up
wife.
with.
Is it being taped?
I hope it is. I can tape
Please
it
tell
again.
her.